Meet Don Leslie Lind, the unluckiest astronaut you've never heard of. This is the story of a 20-year NASA career defined by bad timing, budget cuts, and bureaucracy. But behind the scenes, it's also the untold tale of a pilot and scientist that played a pivotal role in the moon landings, trained for a daring space rescue mission, and came within seconds of a catastrophic launch failure. All done while setting a world record no astronaut wants to break. Lind's early career path is very much like what you'd expect to see in the bio of an Apollo astronaut. After obtaining a Bachelor of Science degree in 1953, Don moved on to the Navy, earning his pilot's license and serving 4 years of active duty as a naval aviator. From there, he went to Berkeley for a PhD in high-energy nuclear physics, followed by a job at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. American manned spaceflight was only a few years old at this point, and it was Don Lind's goal to be a part of it. He was optimistic that his NASA science position would be a perfect stepping stone to the astronaut program, and when the Group 3 astronaut callout removed the test pilot requirement of previous selections, he was quick to apply. But this marked the beginning of Don Lind's life of mistiming and misfortune. For Group 3, NASA required a bachelor's degree and 1,000 hours of high-performance jet time. Meanwhile, Don had a PhD, but was sitting at only 850 jet hours. Thinking to himself that surely a PhD was worth 150 flight hours, Lind asked for an exception, but despite an appeal and multiple written requests over the next year, NASA would not budge. Astronaut Group 4 removed the pilot requirement altogether, as NASA looked to recruit science astronauts with PhDs that would then be trained to fly. While it sounded like a position designed specifically for Don Lind, this time he was 74 days too old. Once again, Don Lind tried to reason his way in, arguing that his pilot experience should be enough to cancel out the discrepancy, since other science astronauts would have to spend months in flight training. Don Lind's application and subsequent appeals were turned down. Astronaut Group 5 reinstated the flying hour requirement, but since Lind had continued to serve in the Naval Reserve, he now had his 1,000 hours. And due to a slight increase in the age limit, this time there was no need for Lind to try and reason his way in. He was part of 5,000 Group 5 applications that were soon narrowed down to 44, and put through a barrage of medical tests and examinations over a period of 6 10-hour days. Fortunately, Lind had been adhering to a strict physical fitness routine ever since applying for Group 3, and thus the 36-year-old had no trouble making it through the final stage to become one of the 19 chosen for astronaut training in April 1966. But despite being selected in a pilot-focused class, from the start, Lind was treated as a science astronaut by the agency, lacking the test pilot experience that was still preferred by many NASA decision-makers. Yes, though 9 of his class would eventually fly to the moon, Don Lind would not be one of them. After finishing fundamental training, astronauts are given technical assignments that become their job and focus until such time they are assigned a crew and mission. Don Lind was teamed up with fellow scientist and Group 4 astronaut Harrison Schmitt to work on lunar surface operations, specifically the procedures and hardware that would be used while on the moon. This involved hundreds of flights on aircraft that were able to simulate 1/6 gravity, where Don Lind tested everything from whether a fully suited astronaut could pick a tool up off the ground, to confirming that they could actually get back into the lander after a moonwalk. At the same time, Don was also preparing for his own mission. This included the helicopter training that was a prerequisite for lunar module pilots. Due to standard crew rotations and the agency's preference for military test pilots and veteran astronauts, the first scientist wouldn't be on the lunar surface until Apollo 19, when Schmitt, a geologist, was slated to fly. Lind himself was hoping to become the second scientist, shortly thereafter. But before that could happen, Don's focus was making sure the first mission to the moon was a complete success. His technical assignment meant he was directly involved in the selection and testing of the 2 experiments that were set up and left behind by Apollo 11: the passive seismic experiment package and the laser-ranging retroreflector. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, budget and organizational changes were taking their toll on the space program even before the first boot had taken that famous small step. In August 1968, Saturn V funding was cut, meaning NASA was only going to end up with 15 of the one-time use heavy-lift spacecraft. Additionally, a new NASA division called the Apollo Applications Program was busy developing science-based missions that would also require Saturn V's and Apollo command modules. Don Lind had a front row seat for Apollo 11, acting as one of the Capcoms that handle communication between mission control and the flight crew. The lunar procedures he had spent years testing went off without a hitch, and shortly after the splashdown of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, NASA released their tentative mission schedule for the rest of the Apollo program. Due to budget constraints, lunar missions were now ending at Apollo 20. But despite the bad news, Don Lind was optimistic. Though crews hadn't been officially named yet, he was confident he would be on that last mission in 1972. And a 6-year wait was pretty easy to accept when it ends with being one of the first 20 men to walk on the moon. In April 1970, an explosion in the command module of Apollo 13 threatened to bring the third mission to the moon and the whole lunar program to a tragic end. Don Lind was part of the hundreds of NASA ground personnel that worked tirelessly behind the scenes to bring the astronauts home. In the end, the crew lost its opportunity for a moon landing, but did make it back alive. At the same time, Don's own moon mission was facing a different threat: politics. With the race to the moon complete, NASA's budgets were under constant scrutiny by Congress. Apollo 20 was cancelled in January of 1970. Apollo 19 and 18 followed suit in September. The reality was clear. There were too few flights and too many astronauts. Don Lind had lost his moon. Feeling the pressure to have at least one scientist land on the surface, NASA moved Jack Schmitt up in the rotation, putting him on the last lunar mission, Apollo 17, in December 1972. And while the professional disappointment of never getting his chance has weighed heavily on Don, he's always admitted that sending a geologist to the moon was the right choice. And as for Don Lind's astronaut career, well, it was far from over. He and those valuable, now surplus Saturn V's were being reassigned to a little project called Skylab. Skylab was an orbital space laboratory built inside the third stage of a Saturn V rocket. It was designed to follow up the American lunar program with a platform for long-term space habitation that focused on science. And if you think this mission goal combined with Don Lind's already long wait would mean he was at the front of the line for a flight to the Skylab station, well, I guess you've forgotten the tragic theme of this story. While the original Skylab plan was for 3-man teams made up almost exclusively of scientists, once again, NASA old-school philosophies won over. Instead, Skylab crews would consist of a commander, a pilot, and a single scientist. And for an unknown reason, when Lind was transferred to the Skylab program, he found himself suddenly reverted back to the pilot designation. Skylab was put into orbit on May 14, 1973, on what would end up being the last launch of a Saturn V rocket. The first crew, designated Skylab 2, followed 10 days later on an Apollo capsule and service module launched by the smaller Saturn 1B. After spending the better part of 3 years preparing and testing equipment and procedures for his new assignment, Don Lind was rewarded with a backup crew position for the Skylab 3 and 4 astronauts, which Don later joked were the most depressingly healthy people you can imagine. But the backup role did come with a unique bonus assignment, as Don and his commander, Vance Brand, were also required to train for the standby Skylab rescue mission. This contingency was implemented to account for the fact that the Apollo command module was not designed to be shut down and restarted a month or two later when it was time for the Skylab crew to return to Earth. In the event of a malfunction, NASA wanted to be prepared to launch another capsule to the station as soon as possible. Shortly after the launch of Skylab 3 in August 1973, the capsule developed a problem with one of the 4 reaction control system thrusters that are used to maneuver the ship. Fortunately, after it was shut down, they were still able to dock with Skylab using the remaining 3 thrusters. But 6 days later, fuel was observed to be leaking from another RCS quad directly opposite the disabled one. Yes, Skylab 3's ability to return home was in real jeopardy. But this was exactly what Skylab Rescue was meant for. Technicians and engineers worked around the clock to prepare the specially modified SLR Apollo for an early September launch. This capsule was stripped down to allow 5 astronauts to ride in a space that was usually meant for 3. And while ground crews worked tirelessly to prepare their rocket, Brand and Lind were busy in the simulator, working themselves out of the mission. After figuring out a procedure for Skylab 3 to complete its re-entry using only 2 functional RCS thrusters, the Skylab rescue crew found their flight cancelled. Lind would later describe their work as very efficient, but perfectly stupid. And thanks to that stupid efficiency, Skylab 3 was able to complete its 53-day mission and return home safely. From November 1973 to February 1974, Dawn once again stood by as backup and rescue crew for Skylab 4, a mission that was extended to 84 days, effectively canceling the next Skylab flight. And I don't think I need to spell out who would have flown on Skylab 5. Dawn Lind finished off the second half of the 70s with a series of almost happened opportunities that weren't technically cancelled flights, but are enough to make one think that the universe was determined to keep him on the ground. NASA had built a flight quality backup station dubbed Skylab B that was originally slated to launch in the mid-70s. For a change, Dawn would have been at the top of the list for a Skylab B mission, but it was decided that the money was better spent on the development of the space shuttle. When Skylab A's orbit began to decay faster than expected, Skylab 5 was briefly considered again. Dawn and Vance trained for a mission that's main purpose would be boosting the station's orbit with the hope that it could be resupplied and used again sometime in the future. Instead, it was determined that the shuttle would be able to handle the job sometime in late 78 or early 1979. When it became apparent that the space shuttle would not be ready in time, once again, Dawn prepared for another flight, this time with the goal to push the station into a safe Pacific splashdown. That risky mission too was eventually abandoned, as instead NASA did their best to direct Skylab's re-entry from the ground. On July 11, 1979, Dawn Lind was in the control room as Skylab began its descent through the atmosphere. And after the initial trajectory showed that the station could potentially pass right through Washington, D.C., his response was, "Aha, there is some justice in the system." It was a comment that wasn't appreciated by all in attendance, as several people outright called him a traitor for even joking about such a thing, though those of us that know Dawn's story can understand the sentiment. Dawn Lind's story is a tale of bad timing and bureaucracy that has been memorialized by a collection of spacecraft that also never got to fulfill their purpose. At the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex in Florida, you can find CSM-119, the capsule and service module that was originally prepped for the Skylab rescue flight and would have been used for Skylab 5. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. is home to Skylab B, a multi-billion-dollar space station that never flew. And instead of launching Skylab B or perhaps propelling Dawn Lind and his crew to the moon, the two remaining Saturn V's became museum pieces as well. But after 16 years of patient service to the space program, Dawn wasn't ready for his career to be laid to rest like these rockets. America was heading into a new era of spaceflight, and Dawn Lind was still eager to be a part of it. Much like with Skylab and the Apollo lunar surface operations, Dawn Lind was put in charge of the development and testing of equipment and procedures for the shuttle program up to and beyond its first launch in April 1981. And once again, if you're expecting Dawn would be one of the first to fly, you would be very wrong. Amazingly, a total of 58 astronauts preceded him on the space shuttle, including 11 that flew twice, and one that went to space 4 times within a 3.5-year span. Meanwhile, Dawn Lind was living a life where if someone asked him what he did for work, he had to say, "Astronaut," while praying there was no follow-up questions. Okay, that's probably not true. While he definitely had his disappointments and dark moments, Dawn Lind has described his NASA career as exciting, rewarding, and a delightful way to spend one's life. And to cap it all off, 19 years after his astronaut selection, this unlucky but patient astronaut finally got his assignment. He would be flying on the Challenger. The 17th Space Shuttle flight mission STS-51B launched on April 29, 1985. And don't worry, this isn't that Challenger flight. It almost seemed like NASA was rewarding Dawn for his service by giving him the first truly science-focused flight of the program. Including Lind, there were 5 scientists on board, and STS-51B marked the first fully operational deployment of the reusable Spacelab module that was carried in the shuttle's cargo bay. As Mission Specialist Number 1, Dawn was in charge of executing a mission plan that involved 15 specific experiments, 14 of which were completed successfully during the 7-day, 111-orbit flight. On May 6th, Dawn Lind landed at the Edwards Air Force Base as a record-breaking astronaut. Yes, no one has waited for a spaceflight longer than him. Looking back at his journey, one could perhaps call him the unluckiest astronaut in history. But at least it's a story of perseverance with a happy ending. Because unknown to anyone at the time, the tragic alternative was just millimeters away. On January 28, 1986, just 73 seconds into its flight, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart, killing all 7 crew members aboard. The disaster resulted in a 32-month grounding of the space shuttle program, and when the cause was traced back to O-rings in the reusable solid rocket boosters, NASA started looking into SRBs that had been used in previous flights. They found that 9 months earlier, as the Challenger launched Don Lind into space, 2 of the 3 redundant O-rings in one of the solid rocket boosters had been completely destroyed, and the third seal had 24% of its diameter burned away. All this happened within 600 milliseconds. By one expert's estimation, Don Lind's flight was just 0.3 of a second from catastrophe. If that last O-ring hadn't sealed the crack, his shuttle would have exploded. It's incredible to think that Don Lind's story was almost one that had him wait 19 years only to die without ever leaving the atmosphere. A deeply religious man, Don would later create a painting showing celestial hands supporting his shuttle as it lifted off. The title of the piece? 0.3 of a second.